One thing that is fascinating that we see in this space in preventing sexual abuse of vulnerable populations, we tend to see organizations spend a lot of time focusing on conducting criminal background checks and training their teams on mandated reporting practices and procedures. Both of those items are extraordinarily important, but only make up a small piece of the puzzle. And so we'll be moving into today some other prevention-based frameworks that we can put into place to strengthen the way your organization manages this risk. Our teams at Presidium over the years in taking a deep dive, whether it's in supporting prevention, crisis management, or investigation work in the field, our teams have learned a lot about adult offenders and what that looks like, and also how false allegations arise. That information is vital because it helps drive our prevention-based work. Some core things that we'd like for you to think about this morning as we talk about a prevention-based framework. When we see adult to client boundary violations or false allegations arise, it's typically because that individual had access, privacy, and control with that vulnerable client. That access, you might want to start thinking about who has access to the clients your organization or your insureds might serve. Sometimes we think about it in the most traditional sense of employees, but don't forget that volunteers, chaperones, contractors, interns, affiliates, and lots of other partners may have access to the clients that these organizations serve. If they travel out in the public, if they take a trip or go somewhere, they may have access to the public. And so we certainly understand, and we'll talk more when we talk about screening, how we might control that access to the vulnerable populations. But start to think now who that is that has access. And then when we see these instances arise, it's typically also because we have someone who has privacy. So in its most basic sense, privacy can be that tucked away space or place at your organization, an office, a classroom, a stairwell, a bathroom. They can be spaces and places on your property. But don't forget that many offenders may build a relationship with a vulnerable individual at your organization and take that relationship someplace else, outside of your organization. So privacy could exist in other physical spaces and places like buses and cars, their home, and other places off-site away from your organization. Privacy can also exist in other non-physical spaces and places like social media, cell phone communications, texting, and email. Those private communications are very similar to that one-on-one interaction in an office or a classroom behind a closed door. So don't forget that privacy can exist in a variety of other places. And then the third thing that we need and see when adult to client boundary violations or false allegations occur is this concept of control. Control can sound or look like, you may have heard the phrase grooming. Some types of offenders use a very defined methodical process to get to know and get close to their victims. In other situations and at its core level, it's that crossing of a boundary, either intentionally or unintentionally. And so those boundaries can include physical boundaries, touching. They can also include emotional and psychological boundaries. And so we'll talk more in a minute about how we build better policies, but sometimes those boundaries can also be about how we build and maintain trust. At their core, they involve power differentials, manipulations or the holding of secrets. And so that control can look and feel like a variety of things, but start to think now about who are the people who might have access, privacy, and control. And the frameworks we're going to talk about today are then designed to help manage these risks to prevent adult-to-client boundary violations and false allegations. But as I mentioned earlier, we also want to prevent client-to-client sexual behaviors and abuse. And they happen in a slightly different manner. And they typically appear when we have an individual with an opportunity, location, activity, and there's decreased monitoring or planning. And so this might arise in some of your higher risk situations like bathrooms and locker rooms, playgrounds or overnight activities, the beginning or the end of the day, and other transitional times. And so we'll talk a bit more about that when we come to how we integrate monitoring and supervision mechanisms to prevent client-to-client sexualized behaviors and abuse. It's also important, and we'd like to share with you this morning, that in addition to understanding how offenses occur, we also take a look at not only individual situations, but larger trends across industries. We could spend a whole day here talking about trends in various industries, but some highlights that we'd like to share with you this morning is, quite frankly, we're seeing across the nation and in other countries, across industries, increased community expectations in how we manage this risk. We're also seeing increased oversight and regulation at higher levels with regard to abuse prevention expectations. In the last year, we saw changes in the availability of criminal background checks with the Child Protection Improvement Acts. We are now seeing the landscape of youth sports shifted dramatically with the Safe Sport Act. Large oversight bodies like the Olympic Governing Board and large national youth-serving organizations like YMCAs and Boys and Girls Clubs and large religious dioceses and organizations, as an example, are starting to shift the lens of how they manage this risk so that they can have more centralized control mechanisms. Through the increased information available in the Me Too movement, our teams also saw a significant increase in historical allegations and soon thereafter large increases in investigations across industries. That has also started to shift the conversation and open the dialogue of what are you doing to manage this risk? There are certain organizations like universities and healthcare where the silos and or traditionally taboo topics are now being brought to light and the forefront in light of recent very public news coverage. And overall, we're seeing more and more conversations about how can we and should we manage this risk. And so for you today, the nice thing to think about is there's no better time like the present to start thinking about how we navigate this space and work towards integrating other risk management controls to design and build a prevention strategy. What we're going to talk about now is start to shift over. We won't have time to move into each of these operational areas to strengthen your frameworks. But what we are going to focus on this morning is this idea of policies. What policies do we need and what role does that play? We'll touch briefly on screening and selection, but please stay tuned. We'll be offering another screening and selection webinar next month. Thank you again to GuideOne for making that opportunity possible. We'll also talk briefly about training, monitoring and supervision, and responding in how we can start to build some of these prevention frameworks. So shifting gears first now into how do we implement and standardize policies? Why and how does this play a role in our abuse prevention framework? At its core level, when we look at managing this risk, policies really get at that element of control. So we think about how adult offenders operate. It's our ability to define and create a bandwidth of behavior, to say what's okay, what's not okay, really set very early a zero tolerance for abuse, and to tell our community that we take this issue very serious, that we have mechanisms in place to address abuse prevention and risk management. And so the other thing to think about is your teams over the years may come and go. Policies allow us to create institutional memory. So you may have programmatic leadership or directors who have had extraordinary practices over the years, but if they retire or leave for whatever reason, there's always the possibility that their fantastic best practices go out the door with them. And so policies really give us this opportunity to create some level of consistency. They allow us to now start talking about how our teams, whether they're volunteers or employees or interns, how we interact with those vulnerable populations that you may serve. And it gets at that core of how do we build and maintain relationships safely. And so what policies are we talking about? These policies can exist at different levels within your organization, depending upon how large or small it is. They allow us to standardize and create some level of expectation. So that zero tolerance piece is there. They also allow us to define the screening and training expectations at a very high level for any of our programs who are going to interact with vulnerable populations, whether those are youth or vulnerable adults. So we can start to define what the expectations are, how you're going to be trained, how you're going to be screened, and how you respond to concerns of any nature. We'll come back to all three of those here in just a minute. But the really big piece is that we get to define boundaries. So if you think about what I just mentioned, this piece of control, that can include whether and to what extent your teams are allowed to be one-on-one with the clients you serve. Can they be alone behind closed doors? What physical interaction can and should look like? What verbal interactions? Social media communications, are they allowed? Can we have electronic communication? So can I text the members of the clients that you may serve, the kids in your program, or the vulnerable adults that you may serve through any programming? Can we give gifts? So all of these things start to get at those physical, emotional, and psychological boundaries and how we build and maintain trust and manage those potential manipulative situations. And so we now get to define what's okay and what's not okay. Our teams at Presidium are the first to tell you that the answer is not always no. We don't always say, no, there's no physical touch, or no, you can never be alone. But it's defining very clearly what that is for your teams and ensuring that everyone knows what's acceptable so that we have that standardized behavior and can start to create that bandwidth of understanding and then tee up when things fall outside that understanding of commonality. We also have the opportunity to integrate how we manage other high-risk activities and responses, which we're going to talk about in a few more operations. But at their core, policies allow us to define how adults can interact with the clients you serve safely and tell everyone else that we take this very seriously and make sure that quality is institutionalized. As part of a prevention-based framework, we also want to screen for abuse. Just as a quick point, we want to make sure that there is no magic test, for instance, to screen out an offender, but it does allow us to gather valuable information about an individual that we are going to give access to the vulnerable clients that we serve. And so if you think about that access, privacy, and control, this is where we get to control who gets to interact with the teams we serve. The screening and selection process allows us to gather valuable information about past experiences, their past work with vulnerable populations, whether those are elderly or children in childcare or other youth protection environments. It also allows us to gather information from a variety of sources. Sometimes what we see in this space is that the human resources team gathers a lot of great information, but then other people may be involved in making decisions, perhaps a unit or departmental leader. And so the screening process, that is so much more than background checks, allows us to integrate this, not just with employees, but all of those individuals who may have access, whether they're volunteers or chaperones or interns. And so when we talk about designing a successful screening process, as I mentioned, it's more than criminal background checks. They play a very vital role. And to be quite honest, in this space, it is one of those areas that it is an expectation that if you are going to give someone access to a vulnerable population, that we have conducted a background screen on them. We will go into all of these details in much greater depth in our January 2019 screening webinar, so stay tuned for more information. But what we do want you to know now is that beyond background checks, which quite frankly are limited in the information that they can provide, although they're industry standard and required, less than 5% of offenders have a criminal record. And so we may not always capture the information that we need to build a prevention framework if we're only using background screening. And so from the larger operational perspective, screening and selection allows us to determine how we can integrate applications, behaviorally based interviewing questions and the process, as well as standardized references, both personal and professional, to gather a more holistic picture of this applicant, their past experience with vulnerable populations, and most importantly, whether they're going to follow all of the policies that we took so much time to put into place as we move through and build our prevention-based framework. So again, we hope that you will join us and be watching the GuideOne space for more information on the January 2019 webinar when that date is finalized. And we hope that you'll join us for a more detailed discussion with our Director of Screening to go into all of these components at a much more detailed level. In building a prevention-based framework, though, we also want to integrate the right training at the right time. Training is one of those things, particularly with the influx of claims arising from the Me Too movement. We hear a lot about training and that we might train our teams on who and how to be a mandated reporter. Again, those are very important things, but only one piece even of the training puzzle. And so as we take a larger look at how this operation helps us create a culture of safety, we want to think about what is the right content, who do we deliver it to, in what fashion, and how do we ensure that it occurs. Some things that you maybe want to start thinking about in the training space is what is the right content. Mandated reporting and how to respond to suspected abuse and neglect is absolutely vital that we tell our teams, but we also want to educate them on how abuse and false allegations occur. So how do offenders operate? Who are they? What mechanisms do they utilize? The more nuanced details of access, privacy, and control. But also, how does client-to-client sexualized behaviors occur, and how does that relate to your organizations? The prevention of client-to-client sexualized behaviors is another classic example of training that we sometimes see is skipped over or missed with teams. So it's an important one to take stock of. Where and how do we provide that type of communication? But we also want to make sure that we educate our teams on not just how to respond to suspected abuse, but how to elevate concerns of any nature. And we'll come to that in a little bit more detail when we talk about responding, but be thinking about it now as it relates to the training and the education we provide to our teams based on their role in abuse risk management. So part of what we want to think about here is not only the content that we provide, but to whom gets this information. So to whom do we provide the training? Absolutely, our frontline teams who are involved in providing services to our clients, whether they're youth or vulnerable adults, but also our leadership. Our leadership might need, and our supervisors might need that information and more. They're going to need to know additional information about their role as a supervisor. For those individuals who are involved in the hiring process, their role in how the screening process plays a role in abuse risk management, and how to integrate those behaviorally based components to gather information about an individual's past experience as it relates to controlling access to our teams. Don't forget about your operations teams on the ground, so whether they are custodians or facilities or operational dining teams may have fantastic information. They may not be involved in the day-to-day direct care that's provided by your organization, but they're an extraordinary source of eyes and ears on the ground to help support this larger abuse risk management framework. So don't forget to train them and provide great information on expectations, those policies that we took the time to create, but also how to report concerns of any nature. This is a great example of our teams here at Presidium. In addition to helping you strengthen each of these operations, whether it's through resources, written or consultation, our teams can also support and help you with this training bucket and a variety of solutions as well. Another thing to think about, though, is what do we screen and train, and that may vary across your team members. And so we like to think about, as you build your abuse prevention framework, to think about the level of access. We may provide a higher level of screening and training to those with the very highest level of access. So for instance, our church volunteer who runs a bake sale might get a different level of screening and training than our teams who are perhaps involved in overnight delivery of services, or involved in more intimate care and personal hygiene for the clients that you may serve. Absolutely, you want to follow any applicable regulations, but also think about the frequency of those interactions, the duration, the type of relationship. Are they a supervisor? Are they supervised by someone else? And the level of privacy that might exist in thinking about that access and how we can build and strengthen your screening and training programs for the individuals on your team and that may have access to the clients you serve. Moving on, this morning we'll talk about how we monitor and supervise for safety. When we think about monitoring and supervising for safety, this operation really gives us the opportunity to decrease that privacy and manage those youth-to-youth interactions or client-to-client interactions for those of you with adults. We typically, in this space, look at how we monitor and supervise our facilities, our teams, so those could be your employees, your volunteers, your interns, as well as the clients you serve and any high-risk activities that they may be involved in. So some things to think about here as we build our policies and navigating one-on-one interactions. For instance, in the policy section, we now get the opportunity to monitor and supervise that our policies and procedures are implemented. We also get the opportunity here to think about how we manage those high-risk spaces and places, like locker rooms, bathrooms, transition times, trips, or overnight activities. For those of you that may serve young children or those who need support and assistance with personal hygiene, we could also have nap, diapering, and toileting situations that come up here when we think about higher risk activities. And so we want to make sure in building an abuse prevention framework that we don't rely on our teams and the expertise that they brought to the table, but that we actually have defined processes for navigating these interactions. So we want defined locker room and bathroom procedures. We want defined processes for how we monitor and supervise trips and transitions and check-in and check-out. All of those things are important because it not only helps our teams on the ground to know what we train on, how we should be doing things, but it also supports our supervisors in what their role is and how we ensure those items are actually conducted. We also have the opportunity to look at our facilities. Do we have operational processes in place to know where privacy exists? Do we walk our facilities? Do we conduct rounds? And then have strategic processes in place to monitor and supervise where those exposures may exist. Again, all areas that our teams support when we get out on the ground and do management systems review or on-site risk assessments. This can be a challenge in thinking about how we navigate across all of our spaces, places, people, and the work that we do. So make sure that your teams are coming together to have a larger conversation. In building an abuse prevention framework, we also want to implement systems for responding and reporting. When we talk about this operation, it's not just reporting, it is truly responding, because we want to have defined processes in place for not just responding to suspected abuse and neglect. That tends to be the big one that people know about and think about. But how do we elevate all of those red flag behaviors and concerns that might not rise to the level of abuse? So for instance, when our teams are on the ground, we often hear about, well, you know, I saw and had a funny feeling, but I didn't really think anything about it, and I didn't think it was a pattern, so I just didn't say anything. Or I've known that person for years, they've worked here for decades, and quite frankly, everyone else saw it, so we just assumed that it was okay. Having defined procedures to elevate those concerns, those red flag behaviors, as well as suspected abuse. We also want to make sure that you don't forget about responding to client sexualized behaviors and abuse. Having all three can help ensure that we're providing immediate reactions to concerns in this space and allow us to also minimize responding barriers. We know all those reasons that people don't report, one of which includes or can include not knowing the process. So after we take the time to define our processes, make sure that we train our teams and ensure that everyone understands and that we reinforce regularly what those processes are. We also encourage you to include an anonymous responding mechanism to help overcome some of those potential responding barriers. At the end of the day, our goal is to promote a culture of safety. I know we've moved through a lot of things rather quickly today, but as we start to tie this together, the end game in creating that culture of safety and building and strengthening each of those operational frameworks is to ensure that we have clear standards, that they're enforced, that everyone knows safety is part of their job. People are investment, that engagement is high, and that we have systems of accountability to maintain and build that culture. But we also know that all of these things can be challenging. We often refer that this is a low frequency, high impact event, meaning that thankfully abuse doesn't occur every day, but when it does, it drives awareness way up. And so as part of that training process, for instance, it's designed to float the learning curve. But we also know that managing this risk takes a holistic approach, and we can't minimize, oh, this would never happen here, we know everyone. We often hear, well, we do background checks, so we're okay, or we have the best people on our team. Everyone's got graduate degrees, or we bring in everyone has the best of intentions. We know what we're doing, and I trust everyone here that they'll elevate concerns. We hear that very commonly when we're out in the field with teams or consulting in a crisis response situation, why they didn't do something sooner. But that also helps us understand that part of building a prevention framework means that we have to have our leadership on board. Organizations with whom we work, we tend to see three big buckets. Those organizations that stick their head in the sand and choose not to manage this risk, we call them complacent. They say, you know what, we know everyone here, this could never happen. And then those organizations that in a heavily regulated environment and world tend to just check the box. They focus on, well, we're meeting all of our minimum accreditation standards, or we're licensed, so we're okay, check, check. We check the box and say, we're okay. You know what, we ran all of our background checks at the time of hire. That's all that we're required to do. We don't need to repeat them. So just check the box, we're moving on, we're okay. Those organizations that truly integrate a culture of safety fall further over to the right on this commitment continuum, meaning that we have very defined operational standards across all operations of the safety equation, and that we have mechanisms in place to prevent drift. That it's not just a commitment to say, yes, I want to keep our clients safe, a thumbs up, but we actually have defined mechanisms, processes, procedures. We have a dedicated individual or teams who their sole function is to ensure that all of our operations across all of the programs and the work that we do integrate prevention-based concepts and are threaded throughout all operations in the space that we have. And so as we start to bring this conversation to a close, there are some things that we want to make sure that your teams are thinking about at a very high level. Do we have a voice from the top? Do we have established standards of care that define how we manage this risk across operations? Do we provide prevention-based resources to support those standards of care? So for instance, has our leadership helped us create policies and procedures on boundaries? And do we actually have the training that we need, the checklist necessary for those monitoring and supervision spaces to integrate those resources, as well as systems of accountability to ensure that those operations are maintained over time? Those cultures of safety take an ongoing commitment to managing this risk. We have seen in very large, very public issues that have come out across industries that it's not just a one and done process. It takes a commitment, a sustained process to managing this risk. Our teams can be available here at Presidium to help you with all of these steps along the way, whether it's in obtaining that voice from the top, helping you to establish those standards of care, or providing abuse prevention resources or the systems of accountability. We'd be happy to continue those conversations. And as you leave here today, we certainly want to open it up and try to leave just a few moments left for questions. But some things that you should be asking yourself, your organization, your programs, your insureds, the teams with whom you may work. Is there an abuse prevention strategy in place? Are there written policies that clearly define those boundaries, getting at how adult offenders operate? Do we have mechanisms to control that control piece? So those boundaries will get at that. Do we have screening processes? Again, thinking about who has access. It may be more than employees. Do we require individuals to complete more than just reactive training? Is it preventative in nature? Some of the trends that we're seeing is that prevention-based training is now a requirement in some spaces. Do we have those defined processes for managing those high-risk activities like transitions and bathrooms and locker rooms, overnight spaces, where we may have a risk of client-to-client sexualized behaviors or increased privacy? Do we have processes in place for responding to a range of concerns, not just suspected abuse, but red flags, as well as client-to-client behaviors? How do we handle third parties, so those that we might not have as much control over, but may have access, privacy, or control? Perhaps they oversee some of our operations, or we rent our spaces and places to these teams. How do we navigate and define those abuse prevention parameters with those third parties? All of these questions you should be thinking about and asking at this time. Know that, again, our teams can help support you in next steps, whether those are policies, online, in person, or other training solutions, whether those are conducting background checks, other trainings on best practices in screening, helping you assess risk at a high, medium, or in-depth level, and just general consultation or crisis management. We also offer a wide range of accreditation programs, whether that is for your organization, programs, and or individuals who are seeking a certification in abuse risk management through our Certified Presidium Guardian workshop. I'd like to now take this time to open it up for general questions, and I'm going to pause for just a minute and check in with some questions that may have come up and answer what we can at this time. If there are any questions at this time, please feel free to enter them into the chat box. It looks as though it's been relatively quiet in the items that have come up, but please know that we are available for additional questions. One of the really exciting things that we did mention in the time that we have left, since there are no questions, is that individual certification process in abuse risk management, the Certified Presidium Guardian program. After this webinar, the slides will be made available, and there is a direct link that you can access that program to take a look at it. It's a 3-day intensive workshop where we take a deep dive into each of these operational areas in how to build a culture of safety and how to create that voice from the top. And not only do we deliver resources and support, but we connect you to a network of other guardians across the nation and the globe who have been through that process. We have upcoming programs that are open for all industries in May and November of 2019. And again, more information is available on our website and through the links that will be available in the slides after this webinar. We do hope that you will join us not only for that program, but for any upcoming webinars. Thank you again to GuideOne for making this discussion possible. And do stay tuned for the screening and selection webinar that will occur in January 2019. Thank you again. Our teams will remain on the line for just a few minutes more should you have additional questions. Otherwise, we thank you again for your time this morning for this conversation on how to build a framework for abuse prevention in the organizations that you may serve. Thank you again.